I'm K D Adamson, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and our invited studio audience to the Marsh building here on the banks of the River Thames. With the help of my guests, I'll be exploring what ESG really means for shipping's value chain, its investors, its people and their future. You join us today in sight of the Great Tower of London, one of this ancient city's most famous and imposing landmarks. Built by King William the Conqueror, it has stood for almost 1,000 years. But the tower isn't William's greatest legacy. In 1085, the Conqueror took an unprecedented step. He decreed that the agents of his realm would be sent out to survey every single shire in England, to create a definitive list of his holdings and to calculate the dues and taxes owed to him. It took more than 2 years. And the result was the Domesday Book, the most comprehensive and complex data set of any pre-industrial society. William recognised the power of information to help him in his objective to rule and tax the population. So in many respects, he was the father of data. Maybe William the Calculator would be a better way to remember him. Today, we consider data a modern construct associated with technology and digitalisation, but it's actually very ancient. The word data comes from the Latin datum, which translates as that which is given, an unarguable fact, the truth. And that's exactly how the Domesday Book was regarded. The data it contained became the truth, but not because it was always correct. It became the truth because it was the data which the king had decided was relevant. The financial information he had prioritised, and as a result, it shaped everyone's worldview. In the centuries since, we've continued to choose and prioritise what data we consider relevant based on our prevailing worldview. And GDP is a great example of that. GDP is just a post-World War II international convention which agreed how we would define and measure the economy. So GDP includes what governments and businesses do, but that leaves massive gaps in the data. Estimates suggest that unpaid care work could account for up to 50% of GDP in high-income countries and up to 80% in low-income ones. This is important because what we value is intrinsically linked with what we measure. Our value systems both shape and are shaped by the data we choose to prioritise and to collect. And until now, that financial data has been dominant, linked to economic, environmental and societal assumptions and priorities which are centuries old. But those priorities are changing. New non-financial metrics, from the Human Development Index to ecological footprint, the SDGs and resource circularity, are giving us a completely different view of the world. It means we're all developing countries now, and we're all developing companies now too, because the impact for business is likely to be profound. For many organisations, the term ESG brings to mind environmental issues like climate change, decarbonisation and resource scarcity, and these form an important element of ESG, but it's not the whole story. Social issues like a company's labour practices, talent management and data security, and governance matters like board diversity, executive pay and business ethics are becoming equally critical metrics. Milton Friedman's famous assertion that the only social purpose of a business is to create profit is beginning to crumble. Even the mighty BlackRock is demanding that companies not only deliver financial performance, but also show they make a positive contribution to society. But perhaps most significantly, ESG is increasingly seen by investors and shareholders as a window into the future. These investors are focused on understanding a company's long-term value creation plan, and they are beginning to demand credible, standardised information to support long-term risk assessments. And that's why ESG is raising profound questions for shipping, questions which digitalisation and decarbonisation alone won't answer. Shipping's leaders are already grappling with lack of regulatory certainty, misaligned incentives, the risks of stranded assets, and the absence of clear decarbonisation technology solutions. But in essence, it boils down to a deceptively simple question. How will I create value in the future? ESG is going to materially change that equation. Organisations are struggling to grasp the risks and the opportunities of ESG. But the reality is that when it comes to ESG, a do-nothing approach isn't a straight line. It's a downward curve, which means there is no time to waste. So let's not waste any more and meet my guests for today. Joining us today is Amy from Marsh. Amy, I believe that you are Head of Sustainability for Marsh, and the first person to hold that position, I seem to understand as well. Next to Amy is Sean. Sean is Business Analyst and ESG Lead for Gearbulk, which is part of the G2 Ocean joint venture alongside Grieg Maritime Group, is one of the world's largest open hatch operators. And next to him we have Roberto Costas, from co-founder, I must correct myself, co-founder and CEO of Deepsea Technologies, one of the fastest growing maritime startups in Europe, pioneering the use of AI in shipping. And I believe you recently secured a pretty hefty €5 million investment as well. Next to Roberto, we have Anthony Gurney. Glad to welcome you, President and CEO of Ardmore Shipping, owner and operator of products and chemical tankers in the worldwide trade, and also a director of Simply Blue Energy, which is, I believe, engaged in the development of sustainable blue energy projects. And then finally, next to me here, from our host today, OneWeb, is Carol Plessy, Head of Maritime. So welcome everyone, and welcome to you guests in the studio as well. I'd just like to say thank you very much for all turning up wearing trousers. I know you guys at home aren't wearing trousers, okay? I'm on you. So let's kick off. Carol, lots of us here know about maritime. Maybe not all of us know much about OneWeb so far. So maybe you can just put us in the picture. What is this network you're building and what are the ambitions for it?
Sure, Kate. Let me give you a brief picture of OneWeb. So we are effectively a new breed of communication provider, and we are powered by satellites. Not any satellite. We have chosen to launch low Earth orbit satellites, meaning they are close to the Earth, and critically they deliver high speed, high performance, low latency connectivity everywhere. Our mission is quite simple, actually. It's very ambitious. We want to connect everyone everywhere, and that's at land, on sea, and in the air. And my role at OneWeb is to make sure that we deliver the best service to the maritime community so they can move forward, implement all those digital strategy and ESG strategies. We are different because we have built in the heart of our network the mobility. We are delivering against requirements for the maritime industry. This is not an afterthought. This is not something we are latching onto another business opportunity. This is really part of our mission to connect the maritime world and all the oceans, including the Arctic.
So this is clearly a definite focus on maritime and shipping. So from where you sit, what are the key impacts that you anticipate that ESG is likely to have on the shipping industry and the wider value chain?
So well, I would like to start to say that we are much closer on our projects in the sense that we are going to launch our solution in 2023. And ESG is very close to my heart. It's a topic I wanted to bring forward. And I think it's worthwhile talking about the E, as you pointed out, the S and the G separately. And ESG is effectively gaining momentum across all industries. Effectively, the financial sector is very much linking profitability and sustainability and survivability to ESG metrics. Shipping is a little bit behind, but this is coming as well for this industry. And we think we have a real part of the puzzle to solve that ESG strategy momentum. And in effect, I see shipping as really not immune to the trends. On one hand, you have the demand side from the customer or customer pool. More and more, you will see large companies like Amazon, Unilever, HP, Puma, and others making demands upstream and downstream on their supply chain, on the transport system. They are responding to the consumer, you and I, you in the room, demands for proving that we are good citizens of the world. On the other side, you have a regulatory push, I would say very much led by the EU, but also at regional level, but global level as well, squeezing the shipping industry like a pincer effect. And finally, as you pointed out in your introduction, ESG metrics and reporting is very much linked to access to financing. And it will very much impact your ability to raise finance, to convince investors to invest in your business and to transform. So effectively, I fully agree with you, there is no standing still. It's either you embrace the ESG strategy and you embrace it early to reap the opportunities, or you probably be squeezed out of the system altogether in a few years from now.
Yeah, you mentioned finance, and I guess insurability is also an element of this. So, and Amy, from what Carol's saying, you know, we're talking here about more than environmental regulations. I described ESG as a window into the future, supporting long-term risk assessments. You're the expert when it comes to risk. Is that what you're seeing, or am I overestimating this?
So we're not seeing challenges to insurability at the moment, but much as we talked about banks being concerned about having stranded assets, insurers are also looking very hard at the portfolios they insure. So insurers' contribution to climate and sustainability is a really strong focus on net zero underwriting. So net zero underwriting, they need to look at the emissions within their portfolios. And just to make sure, to level set for everyone in the room, when we think about emissions, we think about scope 1, 2 and 3. So scope 1, the emissions that you produce yourself, 2 being the power that you rely on, and scope 3 being the emissions that are produced up or downstream. And insurers are really struggling with how do they know what to count? Do they count their clients' scope 1, 2 and 3, or do they just count scope 1 and 2. So let me just give a real life example of that. If we think about the energy industry for a moment rather than the maritime industry. In the energy industry, the actual carbon released as a result of taking hydrocarbons out of the ground, fossil fuels out of the ground, is relatively low. It's about 10 to 15% of an energy company's carbon footprint. About 85% comes when that fuel is burnt. So that's scope 3. So much the same for the maritime industry. What should insurers be thinking about? Should they be thinking about scope 1, the fuels used for transporting the cargo, or should they also be thinking about the scope 3, the cargo that's being transported and how that's ultimately used? So a huge amount of complexity. I'm just going to think about the scope 1 for a second, the fuels that they burn. So let's assume that the insurers are just capturing the data about the scope 1, the fuels burnt by the maritime industry. If the insurance industry has to get to net zero underwriting, they need their portfolio emissions, the emissions of their clients, to be net zero, which means their available capacity to support carbon-intensive industries is really limited. Now, the maritime industry, through the Poseidon Principle, so if I use that as a proxy, has the ambition of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the industry by 50% by 2050. So that means there's still going to be a lot of carbon emissions from that industry against an insurance community that's trying to get to net zero. So there's an inherent tension. So no constraints currently, but much as the banks are thinking about stranded assets, I think ship owners need to be aware that net zero underwriting is moving at a different pace to having 50% GHG reduction by 2050 set by, I've just said who it's set by, it's gone from me completely. Thank you so much, Poseidon Principles.
I was just going to say, actually, for anyone who's not fully aware, can you just give us a background to what the Poseidon Principles are and what they mean right now?
Yeah, so the Poseidon Principles are, the banking industry was very concerned about stranded assets and trying to make sure that they were providing mortgages for ships that were anticipating fuel flexibility, were fuel ready for alternative fuel types to make sure that greenhouse gases were being managed. So that's the banking standards, and the insurance industry is now trying to come together to create its own set of Poseidon Principles for the insurance industries, thinking about how they deploy capital for risk management.
Yeah, I mean, there is a tendency to think if you don't have to report something yet, then maybe it's not worth worrying about. But I think what we're understanding here is there is a lot of stuff going on under the surface, if you like, that is, you know, potentially going to suddenly pop up. And I think when it comes to reporting as well, and standardized reporting, if you look at sort of ESG-oriented investing, I think that's gone up by about 68%. It's like $30 trillion or something now into sustainable investing. So this is really current.
It's very current, but there's complexity in terms of what data to capture. So everybody knows that we need to have more standardization in the way that data is captured and shared. We haven't got resolution for the maritime industry about whether we should be capturing the same kind of carbon intensity data that we are in some industries, or should we be using a proxy, the average emissions rate that the IMO is coalescing around and is expecting to be part of vessel class classifications by, I think it's 2023. And so we're saying data is really important. Sitting here now, I can't tell you exactly what data is important, but being data ready is critical, because I think everything's moving at a faster pace than many of us had anticipated. In my head, I have 2023 as a sort of a bit of a deadline, that I think that we're going to have a lot more clarity around data collection. So being ready for that data, I think, is critical for operators.
And picking up on what Carol was saying about it's not just the E, it's the S and the G, because we do tend to concentrate, decarbonisation is a huge challenge for the maritime industry, we tend to concentrate on that rather a lot. But I mean, if we look at the DJI ESG index, for example, when Tesla, appeared on that, and everybody said, well, Tesla's going to smash the, an ESG index, and in fact it didn't. Because although it scored very well on carbon intensity, it fell down very badly on social and governance. So actually it got a very, very mediocre score. Is that, does that bode fairly badly for shipping? Should we take anything from that?
I mean, I think the shipping industry has more challenges than just environmental. We know slavery, we know bribery. There are a huge number of challenges that I think if there is better transparency and better reporting that we can consistently measure and manage, that will give us an insight into those companies. But then we've got to decide, whose scores are we looking at? Are we looking at the ship owner, the charter party, or the consumer? So who actually owns that risk and that data? And I think there are some real complex issues there that we don't currently have an answer to. So I'm sorry that I'm saying that so much of this there isn't an answer, but they are issues that the industry is trying to resolve.
And I think this is the point, isn't it, that where there aren't answers, we have to actually move faster to try and establish some. And Sian, I mentioned that what it came down to was a deceptively simple question. How do I create value in the future? You're a business analyst and also the ESG lead in Gearbulk. Is that the core question? Is that a question that you and your partners in the joint ventures are asking yourself?
Yeah, sure. So we've obviously sat down and understood that this is coming. And as you all have said, it's complex. So we're currently looking into a process how we can actually give the data that is needed to the various stakeholders that we have. And we launched a project called Project MAPA, which is supporting us with the global strategy to get this ESG up and running, and that we have a process in place to ensure that the data that is required to all our material stakeholders is out there. Sure, there'll be boundaries that we have to obviously look into, and there are different metrics that obviously are not going to be disclosed by some of our joint venture parties, where it will be disclosed by Gearbulk, for instance. But this is all complex, and this is just a road where we have to all go together and try and figure out what is it that transparency means. So what does it really mean to our stakeholder when we are saying we are transparent? So the GLT in Gearbulk is really focusing on this now, and have made it a priority to ensure that we have a standard process in place to ensure ESG as a top priority for us in the shipping industry.
And I guess also in terms of, shipping companies generally, I mean, lots of them are involved in pools or joint ventures. Everyone always likes to talk about data in shipping and say nobody likes to share anything or collaborate. In actual fact, it's collaboration all over the place, isn't it? Yeah. And as Amy was saying, when it comes to what do you count? What scope does this fall into? Where are the boundaries? Presumably, this must take a significant degree of collaboration for you to work with various JV partners to try and start establishing this.
Yeah, sure. So we obviously have been working together with our joint venture parties, and they will have their own process and procedures that they will obviously anticipate to do. But we have to just find the kind of standard where it will all make sense for the group, so that we don't have people reporting on something and Gearbulk reporting on something so totally different that contradicts the business. So that's kind of something we need to establish. And when it comes down to, for instance, just an example, reporting of carbon emissions, for instance, it's so complex to look at the total group and how do we actually report that. And that is a process we are now embarking on to understand how are we going to report on this small metric. And there are loads of other metrics as well where there are definitely boundaries that need to be set and understood how the parties will to report on the specific standard or metrics.
And these are not things that any company has ever reported on in the past, are they? I mean, these are, unless you're a particular green startup that from day one you've been looking at your sustainability. But most established, if I use the term legacy organisations, are not used to doing this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, coming from KPMG in South Africa, one big thing was integrated financial reporting. So big corporates obviously invest a lot of money in integrated financial reporting, and in there you would see they would obviously report on social and on governance issues, etc. But it was only required from the big corporates, and people wanted to see how they make money instead of the profits they're making. Now I think that has changed, and I think it's now coming to where all companies need to do that, because people want to invest in companies or actually buy stuff from companies that are really ESG compliant and have a mature ESG strategy behind the business. So it's a really brand new road we're all going to go on, but I think the more we learn from each other and see how other people are reporting, I think this will somehow become a regulation somehow in the future, probably by 2023 or a little bit later, because it's quite complex. But I'm sure we will see a regulation in place where we have to report on certain metrics. And I mean, there are a lot of frameworks out there today which you can obviously use. And one of the most important ones at the moment is the share capital metrics, which is developed by the Big Four and was obviously chartered by the WEF. And this basically has been developed by KPMG, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, and PwC. And it's a really nice way of just looking into the core metrics that you can report on, and then expanded ones which you can report on. And I think for a mature ESG strategy, you definitely need to make sure that at least the core ones are reported on to ensure transparency within the environment that you're in.
Yeah, and those stakeholder capitalism metrics, as you mentioned, the idea of that was that they were brought together. I think it's 21 core and 34 expanded metrics. And they were brought together by all those big four firms trying to actually look at all the ones out there and trying to get something that would work for everyone. But of course, one of the issues there is what of those do you report? And that comes down to materiality as well. What of this is material to your business and your stakeholders?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to look into the different stakeholders and obviously rank them, prioritize them as to what is material for you. And obviously you'll have different materiality calculations across the whole entire group, for instance, with us. But at least there should be a standard of material stakeholders. And what is material? What does it really mean? And that's something that you should really sit down and think about. What does it really mean to my specific stakeholder that I'm working with? Is this something he wants to see? Is it something he requires? Is it a law or regulation that I have to make sure I am reporting on? And that then becomes material because it becomes a risk, right? If you do not comply, you could potentially have a problem with your license to operate, right? So these are really important parts when looking at what is material and what does that mean for the risk of me being able to operate as a business and my reputation as a business. So
these enterprise risk management and materiality are really intrinsically linked. And I suppose this also speaks to something else that I know you've mentioned to me in the past, that Gearbulk are very, very determined that there is no greenwashing here. And that's something, and I guess Tony, turning to you, we're increasingly hearing that term, aren't we, greenwashing? And actually when we hear how complex it is to report this stuff, you wonder if it's not so much greenwashing, it's just it being very difficult to report the things that you need to report. But I know when we spoke, we were sort of talking about, yes, ESG is important, but actually maybe it's more about a philosophical direction. And I was very interested in the approach that you're taking rather than sort of specific reporting or frameworks. It's more about progressive mindset and culture. I don't know if you could sort of expand on that a little for us.
Happy to. We'll have to take a couple steps back.
Yes, please do.
Think about philosophy. And I'd like to quote a professor of strategy at NC.
Oh, you're not allowed to do that, no.
Well, I'm going to anyway. So, who said that in the 21st century, for companies to succeed, they'll have to scale the twin peaks of economic performance and societal progress. And the very best companies will integrate the two. And that's what we're trying to do. We've been working on this for 5 or 6 years. It's something that comes from within. We think of ESG as a set of external measures that stakeholders use to judge whether a company, what's inside the box or what's inside their soul. Does the company have a soul? For us, everything we do has to be strategically, or the initiatives need to be focused on both driving performance improvement, but also have a progressive angle and purpose to it. And in fact, if you think about the world that we're in today, certainly in shipping, really, companies that are pursuing retrograde type of performance initiatives, without considering the ESG impact, if you will, probably not going to be very successful. And at the same time, companies that are just chasing rainbows and trying to make the world a better place are going to go out of business, right? So the trick is to bring the two together. So we do take ESG very seriously because that's the way we're being measured externally. We've recently, at the beginning of this year, launched our approach to the energy transition, which we call our Energy Transition Plan. Happy to talk about that later. So that would be the E. The S, we just objectively, again, driven largely by performance. I think we've got a very diverse team in the company of something like 12 nationalities out of only 50 people. Our staff is 55% female.
I'd say your board also.
40% on the board and 40% in management. That came quite naturally, actually. We were just looking for the best people, so that worked out very well. And on governance, it's something that's been always important to us. Our heritage is from the private equity world, and they take governance very seriously, and so do we, and it just fits in very well with our philosophy. And so we're very pleased with the rankings that we have in terms of, as a public company in the US, in terms of governance. And
your background is actually finance, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So I mean, I guess that, with your finance head on, you're also looking at this from the other side, and the kind of reporting and the way that's developing. Do you agree broadly with the scope of what's been said, that, this is probably coming faster than we realise?
Yeah, I'd like to make the point that I was a sailor before I was in finance, but that's it's
okay, you're among friends.
That's for later. Yeah, so I think the more pressure that can be brought to bear on the industry to push it in the right direction, the better we'll be. Yeah. I think the IMO so far has been a bit of a disappointment in the kind of lack of framework and certainty. I think companies like us, like Gearbulk, would like nothing better than to have a clear roadmap on what we need to do, because then we would be able to commit capital. Yeah. Yeah. I outlined in my opening about how critical the choices that we make are about the data we prioritise, the data that we consider relevant. And we've had years of discussion about big data in shipping. We need lots and lots of data. I was struck quite recently, I read a white paper by V Group where they were talking about the importance of small data. And what they meant by that was data that you could action, really actionable, insightful data that could be useful immediately to people, whether it's on shore or on the ship. Do we need to reframe that conversation around data? I know I think your attitude is very much to, what data do we really need? We try to think about collecting the right data to drive performance. And, okay, I'll say something and others might want to chime in and have a debate about, but I think in a way, big data is a little bit like Field of Dreams. If you build it, the ideas will come. If you collect enough data and start sifting through it, you'll find the answers. We think we know what the answers are, and we need the data to figure out what's the right thing to do specifically on board the ship. And it's in your DNA to use that technology to optimize. It's not a sort of a Luddite view. This is actually about finding the correct use case for data. We love tinkering with ships. Again, you're amongst friends here. So Roberto, when I listened to Tony talking about sort of mindset and culture and that kind of thing, I was quite interested, isn't it? Because I think an awful lot of people sort of think that sustainability is a technology problem. That's where it comes from. And yet, when it comes to ESG, in the same way as digital transformation very often failed because people thought digital could just come in and change things, and they discovered it was a cultural issue. Is it the same with ESG? Do we need to approach technology and data as tools for change rather than the change in itself?
Yes, and that's an excellent opener. Thank you very much. So essentially for ESG, especially in shipping, we primarily focus on the environmental aspect. I mean, we haven't even begun the conversation about the social aspect. And I really agree with the whole philosophy change that's taking place at the time, because especially for the new generation that's now starting and working in shipping companies all over the world, they don't just care about the day-to-day job that they do, but what does that mean in their sort of hierarchy of values. So for instance, I believe in globalization, and I think that's good for humanity, and therefore working in a shipping company that helps that goal is very important. So everything that you do in your day-to-day life is kind of contextualized with who you are as a person. That's to do with the soul of the business, I think, as well, that it needs to stand for something, not only, just to be a shipping company. And now with regards to ESG, I think that particularly with the IMO, I agree that the KPIs that we're using might not be exactly the best, but even just having a sort of rating and then using technology to be able to just, first of all, on the first level, measure the information. Is a vessel an A, a B, or a C? Is a place to start. Because a KPI, even though even if it's not the best KPI that you'll ever have, if it's universally applied across every fleet, all different vessels, it does show as a, let's say, first benchmark, which vessels are better than others, and overall, like which fleet is better than another fleet. So I think it's important to use technology in that sense to create transparency and create the KPIs that are then going to drive change. And also, because we talked a bit about big data, I agree very much that you need to know what you're measuring. Big data is not just collecting information and hoping that you will be able to use it in the future, because the problem that arises then is that if you just collect information and then start, after you collect, let's say, 1 billion data points, start using them, you have a let's say, kind of contaminated pool of data where you have some good data, some bad data, and you can't tell which is which can be very, very challenging. So I think now in terms of us as an AI company in shipping, we're only starting to be able to realize value from data, and be able to actually use information to help owners by telling them, you know, we've analyzed hundreds of vessels, and we can see that your fleet or your vessel or a certain company policy in terms of how you operate your vessels is lacking in a very specific sense. For instance, the generator engines aren't being used optimally, or for some reason the route that the captain chooses on his own is constantly suboptimal, or the speed changes are suboptimal. There can be different things, and big data coupled with good tech can really help you identify what the main inefficiencies are in an organization and hopefully throughout an entire industry.
And you know, you're using an example there of operational stuff, but I mean, when you look at the way that, you know, S&P is conducting, how ships are bought and sold, I mean, it's almost data arbitrage, there's information arbitrage there as well, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a very big problem currently in S&P, is that when someone buys a second-hand vessel, they have no clue how the vessel was operated before. It's like selling a house and hoping that the person won't discover that the attic floods. So if we have information, I really believe that in the future, the data will create more transparency and more meritocracy, in the sense that if I'm an amazing owner, even if I have only 3 vessels, I should get a premium on the sale of the vessel if I have been operating it properly, if I care about the crew and the social aspect of the ESG, and they do an amazing job in maintaining the vessel at a good standard. So a 10-year vessel maintained by a good crew, built at a certain yard, should have a very different price than the company that, you know, really doesn't care, and they constantly have problems with the main engine because they don't change the spare parts regularly. So I think the data can really provide and shed a lot of light into that direction, create a lot of tangible value for most stakeholders in the shipping world. So that's banks, that's owners, charters that might own vessels. So yeah, and also insurers as well, I think.
And you mentioned transparency. I'm known for talking about this era of radical transparency that we're moving into. And I think the result of radical transparency is contagious accountability. You know, once everybody is transparent about what's going on, then, you know, you have this obvious pressure to behave better. And we've often talked about, you know, there being a race to the bottom in shipping. And this really turns it on its head. It creates a race to the top, doesn't it? Because when you think about it, really good operators, and like you discussed at the moment, this just increases their cost of operation. They're effectively penalised for doing the right thing. So, I mean, do you think that we could be seeing, you know, sort of regulatory ecosystems develop, you know, in this way, so collaborative regulatory ecosystems instead of this top-down regulation that we're used to?
Yes, and first of all, I love the term contagious accountability.
I can't claim ownership of it, actually, but I should.
because that's essentially what happens. So when you create transparency between, let's say, the vessel and the main offices that currently are kind of 2 isolated systems. So the crew on their own are on the vessel doing their work, and the headquarters are doing their own thing, and they just share once a day an email about how the vessel has been operated. That creates a lot of a gap of information between the 2 groups, and it also creates, due to the lack of information, a lot of problems that might arise that are not communicated necessarily to the headquarters. So what's very interesting is that many people are afraid of transparency and don't really like it, but essentially when transparency occurs and you have, let's say, the ship connected to the headquarters, what we have seen as a company consistently across many different owners is that then the perspective of how to deal with a problem completely is revolutionized into, oh, there's a problem as a crew member, I need to solve it on my own. No, rather, as the headquarters already know about it because they have the information, why don't we work together to solve this as soon as possible, rather than keep it a secret inside and try to fix a problem which is how really big problems arise by consecutive like domino effect of smaller issues.
Yeah.
And I do believe that it's very hard to, at the moment, have, let's say, regulation around this, because we're still in the very primitive steps of even the environmental, which is more pressing or equally pressing. So yeah, I think that in the future, this is something that definitely people and companies will focus more on with tangible metrics.
Yeah, I mean, Roberto mentioned IMO there, and I'm waiting for the rotten tomatoes to come my way, but I'm going to defend IMO here. And I'm going to say, IMO's remit stops at the shore. And actually, the problems we're discussing here, the challenges we face, don't happen at sea. They are bigger problems. They're systemic issues. So I think it's unreasonable, actually, to have expected IMO to put in place the regulations that will solve all of this for us that we could. Certainly in some areas, I'm not disputing they could. But if we look at it in that sort of sense, there was a fascinating judgment not that long ago in London in a case where a shipbreaker had died falling from a ship, and the owner, the previous owner, who had sold the vessel to a third party, who had then sold it to be scrapped, was actually found in court to have a legal responsibility to that shipbreaker, even though they'd sold the vessel to a third party ahead of time. Now, I often talk about one of the big shifts businesses is facing is from limited liability to collaborative responsibility. That actually we can't just rely on what we're legally able and expected to do, that now there is a collaborative responsibility. How does that sit alongside the kind of new regulations that we need? What would you like to see in terms of regulation now?
That is such a big and hard question.
I do my best.
So help from the panel, please. I think that's one of the reasons that the regulation isn't forthcoming, is because what do you regulate? Where do you regulate it? Who do you regulate? And so do we need a consistent playing field? Do we need to have a consistent expectation? Absolutely. So I think there are some elements of regulation that relate to the maritime industry, but I do think there's also other issues, such as how we work together. And you sort of alluded to it in the question, and I'm sorry to bring this back to insurance, but when I think about something really big...
Amy, that's why you're here. Okay, yeah.
Okay, good. I'm good with that. When I think about some of the really big issues that we've got to face, we can't, no one business can face it. We've got to solve them as an industry. And some of the regulation, the anti-competition laws, actually makes that quite challenging to navigate. Because anything that we do that could constrain a party's access to a product or the price of a product would be anti-competitive, even if we're trying to do it to solve some of these really large problems. So I'm not sure that the regulation is just at maritime industry level. I think it's also got to enable businesses to work differently than we have in the past. We absolutely don't want challenges with competition. We don't want anti-competitive behaviours, but I think there are other forms of regulation that need to be addressed, as well as the specific looking at emissions, looking at safety standards. So it's a really big and complex question.
And so more enabling regulation is really
that.
What we're looking for. And it's interesting, this discussion about collaboration, about working together, because I don't know if you're aware, but the World Economic Forum came out with this net zero challenge for the supply chain a while ago. And in essence, their idea is that you have people making lots of margin at the consumer-facing end, but actually not with very many emissions. And then the guys at the other end, like transportation or others, who have huge emissions that they're creating, but are on tiny margins. The idea being that you back subsidize in some way. You have an ecosystem throughout which you drive that change. Now, as transparency forces companies through their scopes and everything else to start looking at this, is this likely to happen? I mean, I think the oil and gas industry used to do something similar to this, the knock for knock idea.
So the oil and gas industry, I think, has had a lot of transparency, partly because of the type of joint ventures. And so, as you alluded to at the start of the conversation, actually people working very collaboratively. The knock for knock is a liability regime that was really acknowledging who is the most appropriate person to have liability for an asset. So we can see some offshore installation, and the company that's brought out to repaint an asset, it's very challenging for them to have liability for the value of the whole asset if something that they do on the site causes harm to it. So knock for knock is really saying, I'm going to take care of mine and you take care of yours, because that's the appropriate allocation of liability. So there may be lessons that can be learnt from that framework. I think one of the issues that the maritime industry does need to solve is how a lot of this R&D is funded, and where and who manages that resource to look at new fuel types? What are some of the changes that we need to make? And so how do we collect that revenue? How do we administer it? And how do we make sure that the billions of dollars that are needed to create change are delivered fast and invested wisely in making change?
Yeah, and that kind of ecosystem, I mean, Tony, you obviously have a wide variety of stakeholders, customers, suppliers. I mean, when we talk like this, do you feel the potential for these kind of approaches, a more integrated approach?
It would be nice. And I think the critical point is that the conventional fuel that we use has to go up in price through tax, so that the new fuels, whether it's biofuel or ammonia or methanol, green methanol, is cost competitive. But it's got to be done on a scale basis so that we can kind of plan ahead and figure out ship designs, and then the market will determine what's the most economically viable solution for every given application in the maritime industry. So, you know, the answer is relatively straightforward. The challenge is how to create consensus around that. And I, you know, it was hoped, I think, that the IMO could perform that role, but it might be a lot more, you know, kind of disjointed.
I mean, if we think about the shipping industry over the last maybe 50 years, I mean, it's all been about disaggregation. It's been about finding margin here and there. And is this really a watershed moment where we start to say, no, this is now about, you know, long-term time charters. This is about reaggregation.
Right.
This is about all those kind of things that we kind of pushed out the way to try and get a little bit more margin.
Yeah. Just to go back to the prior point, you know, as an industry, we're used to fuel prices ranging from $800 a ton down to $100 a ton. So we're used to burning every you know, sorry to use the word burning, we consume fuels in every different price point depending on, you know, what the oil market dictates. So it wouldn't be that difficult. But the fact is that the transition will require an enormous amount of capital investment, and this is a very, very thin margin business. In fact, most of the time margins would be a very nice thing to have at all. So it's very challenging. In the long run, it's been a disappointing business for investors to engage in. And so shipping, I think, would have a very hard time attracting the scope of capital required. And it might mean that we have to go back to prior periods in shipping when there was a lot of change. Let's say, for example, in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s in terms of scale economies, where, in fact, up until 1973, 80% of all tankers were on long-term time charter, meaning 10, 15, 20-year time charters to the oil companies, right? Yeah. Why? Because the market wasn't able to innovate that quickly to keep up with the economic benefits. So this time it'll be hopefully driven by regulation, but the capital may need to come through long-term commitments. And
that approach to looking more at the ecosystem now, you know, and we've talked about sharing data, we've talked about transparency. I mean, Sian, in the, you know, to get to the detail of, you know, the kind of projects that you have to do with ESG, presumably this ecosystem thinking is an absolutely core part of that, it's no longer, you're able to be sort of a, you know, an inside out. It's actually suddenly thinking about all my stakeholders and sort of from the outside in, how do we construct these projects? How do we construct these relationships? You know, it must be very, very challenging. Do you have sort of any advice for other operators who are just sort of looking at ESG? Where do you start with this?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important that you start somewhere and start today and not just kind of prolong this, because you really have to get something today. And whether you're using different kind of metrics that are available from the WEF, or if you want to use the different standards out there, that's okay as long as you're starting. The point is that data is important, and that's really the big problem, is that we need to make sure we have sufficient data and the right data that's accurate to give to the stakeholders that require this data. You know, the data also, it is kind of something that moves quite often and quite quickly, right? So it's very diverse, and it's dynamic because it always is moving. And you need to always make sure that you are actually evaluating this. Is it still relevant today than what it was yesterday? Because this is something that's really important for our stakeholders. So I think I would say start somewhere and don't just put it off. I mean, it is difficult, it is complex. There are a lot of examples out there that you can use as a company. But again, it's something that we all have to go on this journey together to figure it out. Whether there'll be regulation, as I said before, we don't know. But I think we will get to a point where there will be something called ESG scorecards. So basically where companies will have to say, okay, I'm an ESG 1 or 2 level, and this will give you the opportunity to then be able to do business with the ESG company, which is also something that you can put on your integrated financial reporting to say that you only do business with ESG matured companies. Are we there yet? No, we still have a long way to go. But again, I think data is so important for this because that's going to form part of ESG, right? That's what it is. If you don't have the data, what you're going to report on? Nothing, right? But again, it's something you have to really analyze, evaluate on a continuous basis because something that's material today is not necessarily material yesterday, and it just changes all the time. It's so dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, Carol, you were talking about, OneWeb's mission to actually connect, to give people access to this kind of data. I thought I'd throw you in a nice stat here. It's stat time, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Like the jingle? No jingle. Okay, right. Well, it's stat time anyway. So there was a survey done by Future Nordics and Vodafone a while ago, and it found that approximately 90% of the data generated on board a vessel, which is just an average of 57 gigabytes a month, 90% of it never comes ashore, never even gets looked at. So when you think about that, the argument for that usually is actually, well, it's costly, it's too expensive. And fair enough, what you do is rocket science. It's literally rocket science, right?
It is.
But actually, they were also asked where the vessels spend their time. And the vessels spend 60% of their time either alongside or in coastal waters, which means they could access lower cost, LTE, cellular, whatever. So actually, when you take all this together, is what we're really seeing here is the time for a wholesale recalibration of the whole attitude to connectivity and communications. Do ship operators actually need a bit more help to take advantage of this evolving connectivity landscape?
Well, I'm glad you're asking about data. I love talking about data, and you guys have been talking a lot about data. I think Roberto said something quite interesting earlier. He talked about the once a day, probably 12 KPI reported on the ship via email, the noon report, maybe it's as it's known. And this is a $100 million asset at sea. And if we compare that to a $100 million plant on land, a modern factory, making any consumer product you can think of, this will generate millions of data points, real time, will be processed and curated real time to adjust for operational efficiency all the time, real time. So this is what the shipping industry needs to aspire to. And yes, it's true, it has been held back for decades by the cost of bringing that data to shore, and also by the culture, as I think Sean was saying, or Roberto was saying, that they are very reluctant to be transparent and exchange all the data. The crew can be reluctant to do so, the ship owner can be reluctant to do so and have a real proper look at that data. So this is changing, not only with OneWeb, but there is a whole wave of new connectivity providers that really want to level the playing field, bring connectivity at sea as it is on land for the purpose of operational efficiency, because as Tony would say, this is a perennial measure of competitiveness in shipping. This is not going away. It's, if anything, it's heightened by those new fuels that are so costly, where operational efficiency is going to be making or breaking your business case for changing fuel. So yes, connectivity is changing at sea. We will bring the same standards, terrestrial grade connectivity at sea, and that's high speed, hundreds of megabits per second, low latency. Low latency, say, what is that? Low latency is the time it takes for the data to go from point A to point B and back. And it's actually a key enabler for cloud solution. And dare I say, big data, data processing, AI, machine learning, they need quite a lot of data. Once you figure out which data you want us to send out, yes, you need to collect it, you need to transport it, you need to curate it, you need to extract the insights and act upon them. So this is only possible once you have affordable connectivity. And this is what is coming aligned with really that wave of change in 2023 and onwards, where effectively technology is no longer going to be a barrier for shipping to evolve. And as we discussed earlier, it's a question of you cannot stand still. If you do not swim, you will sink on this occasion. The other thing I like about data is that it's really, I've read somewhere that it's really the new crude oil. And I think both Amy and Sean were talking about the problem of knowing which data is valid from which data is not valid, and Roberto pointed that out as well. So I would think as data is actually the new crude oil, and data insight, actionable data insight, is actually the refined fuel, and OneWeb will be the transport system upstream and downstream.
You're the pipeline.
We are the pipeline.
I like that. I like that. So talking about data, Carol mentioned AI and ML, which kind of lands us firmly with you, Roberto, again, doesn't it? But it's interesting. We tend to talk about data, and vessels as it's all about driving down cost, isn't it? It's often about how do we save money, but actually, we should now be looking at data as value creation, shouldn't we? And I think when you think about the UN Decade of Ocean Science we're going into.
Yes,
yeah?
Definitely. And if I can just backtrack a bit, because I think Carol's answer was very spot on. And something that I think is very important is that when we say 57 gigabytes of data, like it can sound very inundating. So I think it's the same paradox as having too many choices. You can't make a single choice, like watching a movie on Netflix, for instance. I think the same applies that when things are too volatile, you tend to not make any decision because you don't know what the landscape is going to be like. Exactly. Or it's going to be unpredictable. And I think that although this sounds very grand and very difficult, it's actually much more easy once you have a structured way of implementing it. For instance, if you don't have connectivity on your vessels, just explore what it is. It sounds very complicated with the bandwidth, especially if you're not familiar with tech, but it's actually a very simple process. Or with the data. I think the Pareto principle applies here. So a subset of the data, so 10%, provides 90% of the value. So you might not need data from everywhere. If you just collect from the flow meters data, or the torque meter and the bridge, like some basic information, that's actually most of the value creation. You don't need to get from every sensor on board the vessel to make this effective. Sorry, I just need to say this because it's a very common misunderstanding.
And it speaks to Tony's point as well, that
exactly.
you need a use case.
Exactly.
You need a really solid use case for the data, because I've got stats coming out my nose of the amount of money that companies are spending around the world, basically looking after data. I think it's like 70% of the data in companies hasn't been touched for more than 6 months. So we've basically created a gigantic data cemetery and we're spending a fortune tending the graves. That's essentially what is happening, yeah? So I've got that off my chest. We can carry on now. I'm talking about the UN Decade of Ocean Science because, we tend to think about data on ships, it's operation data. But actually, what the World Ocean Council is talking about in this Decade of Ocean Science is ships as platforms of opportunity. The idea being that, you could use ships to be collecting all sorts of other data, data about, climate, water column, all sorts of different things. And it's kind of occurred to me that maybe this could be an interesting opportunity to use data to actually offset. I mean, if we have vessels that are going to be more carbon intensive than we want them for, the next 10 years, could we be looking at data as, creating value, societal value maybe?
That's a very, very interesting point, and I think a very complicated answer. I think definitely yes. So the data that vessels could collect could work on two levels. So the first one is the straightforward one, which is to collect data about how the vessel operates, and then you extrapolate that knowledge to help other vessels become more efficient. So that has a lot of value in itself as well. And I think on the level of using vessels as platforms of gathering information, platforms of opportunity, I love that term as well.
Again, I can't claim ownership.
Yes.
I think that was Paul at the World Ocean Council, so, but don't tell anyone.
Okay, I won't. So I think that there is a very big opportunity to collect information. For instance, we don't know what the wave amplitude, that's a very big problem in shipping. We don't know the wave amplitude in different parts of the ocean. That's a major factor that affects fuel consumption. If we had, like now on the top of my head, like an accelerometer on a vessel, and we knew how it, how it's influenced by waves, and we could then use the data from the accelerometer to better enrich our knowledge about global weather or the ocean, that I think could have a lot of value in itself and could help by creating, let's say, a more societal and commercial value to the whole industry.
And it's an interesting point, I mean, more broadly than shipping, but still in the blue economy. I mean, you may be aware that what they're doing at the moment is they're testing whether submarine fibre optic cables can actually be used as tsunami warnings. So you actually put sensors on it because you can get all sorts of data from those cables that give you advanced warnings. So, maybe we should, I mean, I do a lot of the blue economy. Obviously, Tony, you're involved in, sustainable energy and that kind of thing. Do we need to be thinking more widely about this?
Yes. The question is, how do you incentivize companies to do that? And I think if they philosophically feel more strongly about being progressive and contributing, I think that would certainly make a difference. But yeah, there's a lot of data that we could be collecting.
From existing infrastructure?
Yeah, on board the ships.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, this really kind of gets us...
We do have accelerometers, but nobody's asked us for the data.
And isn't that a perfect example?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is what the World Ocean Council is kind of trying to do with its, it's called the Smart Ocean, Smart Industries Programme, the idea being that they will broker, if you like, you have a vessel, you have scientists who want equipment, you need readouts and sort of bringing that together. But it does strike me that, as I say, this is getting much more into the S of the ESG, and there's a big group of people that we haven't kind of talked about yet, which is the seafarers, our seafarers out there. I mean, you don't need to be anything to do with the maritime industry to know, the pandemic has really exposed, some terrible stuff for them. And it occurred to me the other day that actually it's brought all of us closer to the experience of a seafarer than we'll ever have again. We've been isolated from our friends and family. We've been in a constant state of hypervigilance. We've struggling with mental health very often, subject to arbitrary rules that we have no control over. And importantly as well, finding out that while digital connectivity and contact is important, it's just not the same as being there in person, which I think is something maybe we forget. So, I mean, I'm hoping that is going to, serve as a bit of a catalyst for change. But I thought as we began to talk more about people, I would share with you a report from Edelman, actually, that was published this month. It's called The Belief-Driven Drivel. Yeah, that may be a Freudian slip. No, the belief-driven employee is what this report is called. And they actually surveyed a lot of people around the world, lots of working people around the world. And these are some of the results. A majority of the employees now choose jobs not just on salaries and benefits, but also social impact and their personal belief. 76% say that they had a higher expectation of their employer than they did 3 years ago. 76% again said they felt more empowered now to take action within their organisation, including leaking and whistleblowing. Many employers now say that their workers, not their customers or their clients, are their most important stakeholders. What does all this mean for the traditional business of shipping? And Tony, I was going to ask you this, because I spoke to Kenneth, the president, CEO of TK, and he talks about TK being a people company that runs ships. Is that what every shipping company is going to have to be in the future?
Yeah, and I think they really are, and they probably know it. And they have different traditions and cultures that they come from. But the fact is that you can't improve performance without the crew on board driving it, because they're on the spot. I think ashore, we're seeing generational changes. My generation has a different view of work than millennials, and that's great. So I think that in order to attract the best people and to get the most out of them, you have to have a different approach, and we're very happy with that.
Yeah, because I mean, you focus very much on seafarer programs, respect, and sort of really involving them in the business.
I think it's right from the start, and this goes back to when we formed the company 11 years ago. Our main objective was to empower the seafarers to be professionals and not just operators. Yeah. An operator pushes buttons, and when something goes wrong, they call the superintendent, and then take no risk. A professional is experienced and proud and has depth of knowledge and is willing to basically take charge.
And that kind of speaks to the point that Roberto was making, that transparency actually enables people to have more of a relationship like that.
Well, the transparency can cut both ways. So, it can empower people ashore to start telling the seafarers what to do, but they're not on the spot, so they don't really know what the weather conditions are, what's actually going on. So the systems that we have on our ships that drive performance are primarily a tool for the bridge team, not for data miners ashore to tell them what to do.
Yeah, I mean, Amy, from the perspective of this idea that employees are now your biggest stakeholder, I mean that must come into risk management and things. And I mentioned whistleblowing and all sorts of stuff. Yeah, definitely, and we see it cross industry. And I take Tony's point about generations, but I think we see the fact you said I think 76% of employees want to work for mission-driven organisations. I think that shows that it crosses generations. The maritime industry, I do wonder about that. Are we having a very Eurocentric view? Because do seafarers in all geographies have the same level of empowerment
that, Tony, you're talking about, do we think that the seafarers in some geographies have that same ability to really influence the company and influence outcomes? So I would question that. But from a risk management perspective, yes, I think we see employees in all industries being far more engaged in their company's behaviours, that their companies are doing what they say they do, this concept of greenwashing or just not being as transparent, certainly calling them out where they're not. Now, if you then say, so how does that risk manifest itself? It's not a risk that typically manifests itself in insurance, but it can manifest itself in share price, which then ultimately would become directors and officers. And if we see the influence of climate and sustainability is having on corporations, and I think it was March this year when we saw Shell with the climate change legislation in The Hague, and we saw Exxon in the US with changes to their board because a minority shareholder felt people should be, that Exxon should be moving at a different pace. So I think it's employees and it's multi-stakeholders that are taking a far more active voice, and I don't think it's just one generation.
Yeah, we do tend to have a tendency to sort of talk about Gen Z or, Gen Y. I think as a klaxon goes off somewhere every time a futurist mentions, Gen Z. But it's very true. And I mean, I had a conversation with a CFO of a very large company, and I was talking about this, and he said, look, we all felt like that. We all wanted to change the world. It's just we didn't have the tools that these guys do. And I think actually what you're seeing is an alignment actually in companies of everybody would really like to see this happen. And it's almost like they're capturing the wave of being able to do this now. It's an inbuilt desire that's actually been repressed almost, if you like. I mean, another part of this I think is interesting is we often talk about family businesses. Shipping is a lot of family businesses, and you often hear that that's a bad thing because they can be too conservative or this and the other. But actually, I've always taken a slightly different view of that, because what you tend to find with family businesses is they think in generational terms. And actually, these are generational challenges. These are not, a CEO you've got for 3 years who comes in, with a remit to change something, then go away again. These are people who are thinking about what am I going to be handing on,
They're not worrying about quarter to quarter.
Exactly. And there's a huge tension there now, isn't there? Because these challenges we're facing are not going to show up in the next quarter. But I wanted to ask you about this, Roberto, because you are, a hot tech guy, but you also come from a very prominent shipping family. So I was quite interested in if you wanted to share a little bit about how you felt with, the way that this idea of purpose and everything else in shipping and family businesses. What's your view?
I think it's definitely, because I also myself embrace this idea. It's different, for instance, if you're a builder, it's different like building a house or building the Sistine Chapel. Like it's, as a perception, it might be the same actual work, but how you perceive it and the value that you get and the satisfaction is very different. So I agree that this is the correct way forward. And I'm a big believer in environmental and climate change and that we need to take action. I actually wanted to study environmental engineering when I was in high school. The only reason I did mechanical was because I thought I'd do something broader. But I think that all of these are very, very important. And for the shipping company of the future, as I think everyone on this panel agrees on, we need to actually encapsulate a different mindset into doing business and into not looking at the next quarter, but rather 5, 10, 20 years ahead. And I don't think that that should be only something that people who have a family businesses should do, but it's actually, I think, a more responsible mindset of doing business in general. Even if you're a CEO for 3 years, you should be looking at the long-term health of the business rather than the short-term goals and achievements. But will hinder progress down the line.
Yeah, and I mean, Sean as well, just thinking, of course, Gearbulk and G2 Ocean, Grieg Maritime Group, those are very well-known family businesses as well. So I guess, there's a little bit of a theme here, and yet that's very much ESG is being embraced and driven by the leadership of all those companies. So it's quite an interesting thread that, we've picked up here. Carol, I'm fond of saying that the future of profit is purpose. And that can sound a bit cheesy, until you sit on a panel like this and you hear, this coming from, the world's largest insurer and some big ship operators and, this tech guy here too, But seriously though, it seems to me that companies are being given an unprecedented opportunity here to monetize not just their assets, but their values. And that, you know, could that be a genuine, sustainable competitive advantage? Because technology is great, but actually technology is going to be table stakes, isn't it? You know, you're going to have this technology. But the thing that's going to really make a difference is the way maybe you approach your business. So OneWeb talks about connectivity with a purpose, which I really liked. When you strip away all the incredible technology and the rocket science and the launches and all that, can we distill the answer to the question we set ourselves? How do we accelerate ESG strategies in shipping, or indeed anywhere, into actually recalibration of corporate value, a cultural shift towards meaningful purpose and ecosystem thinking?
Well, yes, connectivity with a purpose is very much one of our mantra. And when you strip away all of the technology, the satellite and the complex rocket launching, we have this strong purpose at heart. This is the core of our business. We are very much engaged in connecting remote schools in Alaska, Canada, remote research station. And I absolutely love the idea of vessels as a platform of opportunities.
Damn it, I wish I'd made that.
So for me, connectivity is this foundation layer that's onto which you can build your digital strategy and onto which you build your ESG strategy. Connectivity is so relevant to the seafarers. You talked about the seafarers. I was reading the Seafarer Happiness Index, saying that's 1.9 million seafarers in 2021, and their happiness towards feeling isolated is really going down. It's one of the most isolating carriers on the planet. And I think connectivity can change that in both ways. First of all, they are demanding, not expecting or hoping for. They're actually demanding now to be connected at sea as on land, to have the same abundant, cost-effective, at cost or free online access as they would have at home. And I would say they have a point, because connectivity is increasingly seen as a human right. And I think it's just a matter of years before regulation comes across to say you will be mandated to provide it to your staff, specifically seafarers, very much free or at cost at the very least. And costs really benchmarked on the terrestrial standards. So that's one thing connectivity can do for the S, if you want. The other part of it is connectivity enables the automated ship, highly automated vessels. And who knows, maybe half of the crew will actually now operate the ship from shore and effectively have a much better work-life balance, possibly interest I wouldn't say the millennial now, but the Gen Z to move into shipping. During the pandemic, there are so many people that cancel their internship and cadetship into shipping because it didn't seem to be like a nice prospect, with the headline saying that 400,000 seafarers were stranded. So connectivity is really important if you want to take care of honor your social contract with the crew. Connectivity is also a fundamental layer enabling the regulator to effectively demand from ship owners to demonstrate compliance all the time, everywhere. And that will effectively sift actors between the good citizens of this world and the others.
And that's what OneWeb wants to be, a good citizen.
We want to be a good citizen. We are very much committed. We want to walk the talk. We want to support the vessel as a platform of opportunities. I just want to see all these vessels gathering health on all the oceans all together, and effectively shipping moving from a polluting industry to very much confirm its place as the most cost-efficient, safe way to transport goods around the world, being a responsible citizen and being good with governance and compliance.
So there are no silver bullets, but presumably we need to build these strategies
somewhere.
together.
You need to start somewhere, and having a well-connected ship is definitely a place to start.
Good place to start. And that seems to be a good place to stop, actually, and to maybe see if there are any questions from our studio audience. I don't know if anyone would like to ask anything of our fantastic panel here. We have a contender.
Yeah, Peter from Tome Group in Singapore. I have two questions, if I may. The first one is the cost of decarbonization. You had quantified it a little bit. With all the levies and so on, it could be for low carbon emission fuels, the additional cost could be around $300 per ton. what would you feel, looking at all the stakeholders that were mentioned, what would be a fair distribution of that load across the value chain? And my second question, if I may, probably also to you, because we manage some of your ships. If I would be now a ship owner, and I would follow this crazy mode now where I see a container ship can get $200,000 a day. And now, of course, all the new building slots are snapped up until 2024. So everybody runs in one direction again. And we are learning that all the circumstances are undefined. So if you're now starting to look at cradle to grave way of looking at things, how can this kind of behavior be justified? As a ship owner, how can I make such decisions? How can I build a new ship with conventional engines anyway at this moment? At this moment, we know that we know nothing, right?
Tony, did you want to pick up that question?
I'll take a stab at that. Yes, we do have some ships under management with Tome Ship Management. I think the answer on the way the market works right now, the answer on who's going to pay is quite simple. It's going to be the customer and therefore society, just as when the price of fuel is 200, that's really built into the voyage cost, the same as when it's 700. So I don't think it'll really be noticed. That's the irony. We just need to come up with a mechanism to level the playing field for the new fuels so that we can actually start making decisions and build ships. So that's, I guess, the point of view there. I don't know if anybody has a different view.
I agree.
Sean, did you have from the Gearbulk perspective on the costs that are coming down the line?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that is a fair point to make. I mean, if you think about it, when you look at taxes, for instance, I mean, who at the end gets that is the end consumer, right? So obviously prices will increase because the cost increased, obviously, for the ship owner himself. So I do agree with that. Is definitely the point. But we need to look into different ways and how we are going to make new builds out there in the future. I mean, it's not acceptable anymore just to have the old conventional way. And I think there are new technologies out there that they're trying to find new ways how to reduce fuel consumption, how to reduce the energy burn, etc. We just need to get to that point where we actually are testing it quicker. And I see a lot of companies at the moment, also in Switzerland, which are busy looking into new technologies and new ways of how a vessel should operate. And I think this is something that will be pushed harder now because of ESG. So I think a lot of investment will come now to try and reduce that. There's something crazy that the shipping industry contributes to a lot of the CO2 emissions in the world at the moment, and we need to do something now to reduce that significantly. And what is that? The main reason for that? That's something we all have to think about, right? So yeah, Gearbulk at the moment, we're obviously on a decarbonisation roadmap. We are looking at how we will do this, etc. There are different strategies we are following as to how we will potentially look into that and how we will try and reduce that. But at the moment, it's something obviously we have to keep for ourselves because it's an opportunity for us. So we wouldn't want to give that information out because that could be a threat. And it's the same for ESG as well. I mean, if you think of ESG data, like we all say, data is going to become available. The ships should be connected. But it's what do you do with this data? That's the important point. What is you going to do with this data? Because yes, give data to everybody, but does this data not create a threat, a risk of a threat that you're exposing too much of your business, right? So to answer the question again, I mean, yes, I think new builds are going to be, very, very much developed to a better way of shipping in the future.
May I add to that?
Yes, and then I'll come to you, Roberta.
Yeah. I think that the concern around stranded assets, well, clearly the banks have been worrying about this for some time, but I think that there are many types of assets in society that are built on the assumption of insurability, and some asset classes that could be flawed over the period of their life. Now, I'm not saying that specifically in a maritime context, that's a general industries concept. So when we think about building ships now, if I was a ship owner, I would want to be multi-fuel ready. I would want to be anticipating what does the future look like, because I strongly suspect as a citizen rather than a maritime expert that alternative fuels will be mandated by various stakeholders before the mortgage is up on that vessel. So yes, we have to do something when we don't know anything.
Roberto, do you want to just quickly, and I'll see if I can get another question in.
Quickly,
Go ahead.
Just one thing. I agree that the customer at the end of the day will pay for it. But I don't think that it will be unnoticed. And the reason is, the higher the price of fuel, the incremental changes that differentiate one company from another will actually create a bigger gap between them. So for instance, if you save 10% now by using voyage optimization, it'll be much more evident into the cash flow of the company if the price of the fuel due to carbon tax or ammonia fuel is augmented. That's my only point. Yeah.
Yes, interesting. Is there maybe time for one final question from the audience?
Mark from Lloyd's Register. It was actually going to be 2, Kate, but obviously you can decide who gets this one and gets to address it very quickly. What's been discussed here are significant and complex challenges, but what we've heard from a number of innovators, whether it's Ardmore or Deepsea or obviously Gearbulk, but you know, there's a lot of other operators out there who are not really at this stage still putting their head in the sand around ESG. I mean, what does the panel suggest are the first steps that you can take on this journey, and really, you know, what can you do to create real progress very quickly?
Can I start with that?
Thank you, Mark. Yes.
So I heard from one owner, he said he was really upset because the banks were making them do a newsletter to the fleet. So start with a newsletter.
Okay, start with the newsletter. Is that? It's serious. This is complex, isn't it? This is an absolutely massive thing. And I think, was it Roberto? You started by saying, you know, start small.
Yes, and I agree that it can seem very daunting, like when you embark on this journey. And I think that the newsletter is a very good first approach. But I think that the basis of everything is just to have information, just to start using data and collecting it, and then to start seeing if you can use it in a meaningful way. I think that's the first step of you embark on this journey. And once you see that it's actually not as complex as you thought beforehand, you can start optimizing different elements and working with the ESG criteria set by the IMO to improve your fleet and benchmark how your fleet does against the world fleet, etc. So I think data is the key. Sorry, just having good KPIs.
And Sean, I guess what you were saying there, that it needs to be led from the top. I mean, there's a project, and where does it start? It started from the owners of the company saying this is something that is important to us, and that we need to designate someone. You're the ESG lead as well as a business analyst, so maybe actually put a line in the sand.
Yeah, exactly. I think you know, it must be a strategy from the top, 100%. That's correct. But you need to find the end goal, right? You can have all this data, but what is the end goal? What do I want to report? And then you work backwards. So what do I need to do to get that information in order to report, right? So, and then yes, you enable it by all the specific technology enablers that are out there. But you have to definitely look into, okay, what is the end goal? We want to report something that is important to our shareholders. And how do I get there then, right? And that is obviously the mechanism, the process that you have to build. And again, companies will differ what they want to report, what they don't want to report. Again, there's a risk if you report everything. There's a risk because there could be some things that are, from an opportunity perspective, a threat. So you don't want to report everything. But just start with the process of, okay, fine, I need to report something. I want to make sure this is materially correct to my stakeholders that need this information, like banks. And yes, a newsletter potentially is a start, yes. But there are other ways also of doing it. If you pick up an integrated financial report, there's shipping companies that do it. Pick up that and look at that, and you can see exactly what is in there and what kind of metrics they're reporting against, which is combined from the GRI, the sustainability goals of UN, but they've developed this. There's so many ways. Just pick up that as a start and then say, okay, how do I get this information?
So we start with mindset. We start with looking at data, financial data, and presumably learning a bit more about the connectivity options that are going to be available out there. Right, Carol?
Hopefully, that would be underpinning it all.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of my guests today for sharing their insights, and of course to Marsh and OneWeb for hosting us here today. And thank you for joining us too. To paraphrase William Gibson, the future, like ESG, is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. I hope today has encouraged you to think a little differently about what constitutes relevant data and how reporting it might help us to reframe the challenges we face and secure shipping's license to operate and grasp the real opportunities on the horizon. I thank you for your company. Goodbye.